Hello and welcome to the course on Introduction to the Psychology of Language. I am Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur, and this is the final lecture of the second week. This week, as I have been saying, we have been talking about language development in infants and young children. We have been looking at various challenges that the children need to overcome or undertake in order to acquire language and speak as the adults do. There are, as we have seen, quite a few challenges: segmenting the speech stream into chunks, making sense of each of these chunks, understanding what each of these words mean. In the last lecture we talked about that. Today we are going to talk about slightly more complicated things. Okay, so today's lecture is basically going to focus around acquiring morphological knowledge and acquiring syntactic knowledge. Now, before I go into the chapter, let us try and talk about what does morphology mean or what does syntax mean. Morphology is more concerned with the makeup of words. How are the words made? We know that words fulfill different grammatical functions in the language, and in order to fulfill those different grammatical functions, the words are kind of changed using particular techniques. Some words can be add if you have to go from a present tense to a past tense version of a particular verb. I would like to sleep today, or versus I slept yesterday. In order to convey that slept is about yesterday, I change the word sleep into slept. There is some morphological variation that is happening. Also, we kind of add in terms of add things to the word. Say for example, we add play and played, so we add ed to convey past tense. We add suffer to suffering to ing to suffer to make it suffering in order to kind of convey the continuous nature. Or we say for example, say apple and apples and mango and mangoes, we add the s to add the pluralness. So we kind of change the words that are known in a variety of different ways so as to kind of get the grammatical function fulfilled of that word in particular scenarios. So that is typically what morphology is about broadly, and I am kind of giving you a very watered down version of morphology, precisely also because I am not really describing it from the accurate linguistics perspective, but just to try and understand what morphology basically means. I think this bit of an introduction should be enough. The other part is syntactical knowledge. What is syntactic knowledge? Syntactic knowledge basically is about the rules that govern the words. Okay, so we know that if you remember in one of the in the last week in one of the beginning lectures, I talked about the definition of language, and I said the language is simply a system of symbols and rules. We talked about symbols, which are the words, and we now have to talk about rules, which are how are those words combined to create meaning or to convey particular kinds of message. Say for example, cat eat rat, or say for example, cat is eating the rat, or the cat ate the rat, or the cat could not eat any of these things. How do you combine the three words cat, rat and eat to convey different kinds of messages? What do you add, what do you subtract, what kind of variations you bring in, what are the rules that are used here? That is precisely what syntax is. Okay, again a slightly watered down version of what syntax could be. We will talk about some of those things in the later versions as well. Now, let us share some observations. So, it is known that children from about 2 years onwards begin crafting short sentences, those that they have never heard before. So, they start creating spontaneous speech. Okay. Remember, we had this discussion about animal communication and children's communication, and we said that for the most part animals are not able to create spontaneous speech or ask questions or basically to create speech which is not made to get a specific end. Children start creating lots of speech, lots of spontaneous speech from the time they are around 2 years of age. Gradually what happens is that these approximations get better and better and they better and better, and they get to a point where it is almost similar to adults' language. Now, what we are going to talk about today is from this point 18 months to 2 years to a point where the children's output or production of speech is equivalent to that of adults. What are the challenges here that they need to surmount? What are the challenges here that they need to overcome and reach to a point where they can create speech of that kind? An important question that we can ask here is how do children acquire the skills to form grammatical phrases and sentences? How is this that the grammar kind of starts setting in? Let us say there are three kinds of knowledge that a child would need in order to kind of be able to create perfectly grammatically acceptable sentences. Okay. So, first is the knowledge of word categories. So, the child needs to know that a particular word is a noun, it's a verb, it's an adjective, it's an adverb, and the child will need to kind of have some knowledge of these word categories, and by virtue of these word categories, what are the function of each of these words. A noun is used to represent an object, a verb is used to represent an action, an adjective represent a property of that object, an adverb is used to represent the property of that action, things like this. The other knowledge is morphology. As I was saying, children must learn different forms the words can take and their relationships. So, sleep, sleeping, slept, or drink and drank, think and thought, or say for example play and played. So, what are these different forms that the words can take, and what is the relationship between these forms? So, played is the past tense version of play, sleeping is the continuous tense version of sleep, things like that. And then comes the phrase structure knowledge. Phrase structure knowledge is basically knowledge about the correct ways of combining words into phrases and later into larger sentences. So, all these three kinds of knowledge together will enable the child to produce a language in a similar manner as the adults would. Okay. So, this is what you have to remember. Now, as always, or as this chapter was concerned, there are two possible approaches to look at how these knowledges might come. There is the nativist approach, which says that there is an innate universal grammar that plays a central role in informing the child about these three types of knowledge. So, people like Chomsky and Steven Pinker, they have talked about aspects that they say that there are all of these basic knowledges that the child needs to perform perfect language is already innately available to the child, and what the child needs to do is just to activate or reactivate, so to speak, that innate knowledge by coming up through certain kinds of experiences, doing a little bit of a hit and trial, but precisely everything is already there. The other approach, the learning theorist approach or the probabilistic approach, says that what children do is that they acquire linguistic knowledge by gradually discerning patterns from the systematic input. So, they get a lot of input, they analyze that input, they analyze these particular patterns, and they use their patterns in an incremental way in their own speech. While they are using those patterns or the knowledge of those patterns incrementally in their daily speech, what they are doing is they are gradually approaching a point where their speech also starts to be error free and much like that of their adults. So, these are the two contradictory approaches, and we will see with respect to each of the kinds of the knowledge that we talked about now, how are these two theories pitted against each other. So, let us talk about word category knowledge first. Now, the nativist view about word category knowledge is that the knowledge of word categories is innately present, and what the child needs to basically do is use something called semantic bootstrapping, which basically involves the child to populate each of these categories, nouns, verbs, adverbs, with specific instances from its own language. Okay. So, learning is basically based, so semantic bootstrapping says that learning is basically based on the child's ability to distinguish between objects, actors and actions independent of any linguistic labels. So, the first the thing is that the child kind of figures out, okay, this is the event that happened, this is the actor, this is the patient, this is the object. And gradually the child starts kind of, when they have enough examples of this kind, they put all actors together, they put all objects together, and they put all actions together. This is how they would populate the categories that are already known to them in an innate sense, so to speak. So, basically what the child is doing is the child is mapping concepts, objects versus actions, to linguistic tokens, that is nouns versus verbs. Pinker says that in 1996 says that children must be using semantic notions as evidence for the presence of these categories. So, as they start understanding the world, that is how they are kind of picking these things up. Okay. So, the baby ate the oatmeal with the spoon. What happens is that the child is having this sense of the sentence, and the child is looking at the world, and the child is seeing, okay, what is happening here? There is a baby and the baby does something. What does the baby do? The baby eats. So, what does the baby eat? The baby eats the oatmeal. How does the baby eat the oatmeal? The baby eats the oatmeal with the spoon. And gradually, when the child completely is to the point of understanding this sentence, what the child is doing is, if you remember, we were talking about syntactic bootstrapping earlier, it is very similar. What the child is doing is the child is picking up the understanding of the world and mapping it to the words that are presented. So the baby is an object, okay, this could be a noun. Ate, something is being done, that is an action. What is being eaten? The oatmeal, so that's also a noun. What is this being eaten with? Spoon, that's also an object, that's also a noun. So this is how gradually I think Pinker would believe that children are acquiring knowledge about these specific word categories. Now this is one proposal. There is another proposal as well, obviously, and this other proposal is from the probabilistic perspective or the learning theorist perspective. What do the learning theorists say? They say that it can't be that the child's innate knowledge of word categories will be the same as that of adults. So it probably could be a far stretch to say that children know the world of words as much as the adults know it. So it's kind of a little bit too much to expect that children also appreciate the world in terms of nouns and verbs and adjectives and adverbs. So there should be something else that is happening here. And what is it that's something? And what is the proof for that? It's been shown that children don't replace nouns with generic substitutes freely. So they not say, for example, they don't start replacing nouns like dog and cat and other kind of nouns with other nouns. So they are not really looking at them as in the same class as proposed by the nativist school. What is happening on the contrary is that children's word categories are probably based on the concrete semantic properties of those particular objects. So this is something that I am doing, so I am waving my hand, versus this is something, this is a pen. So the concrete semantic properties of this object will tell the child that this is an object and this is a different class of word, versus the semantic property of waving my hand or moving my hand is something different. On the basis of these properties is that the child will arrive at these different kinds of words that exist, and it is kind of a difficult thing to assume that the children already know some of this. Okay, so that is something that this particular school is trying to say. Further, they say that the category structure that children develop, it reflects the kinds of language that the child is exposed to. And because there is variation with respect to the kind of language that the child is exposed to, you can say that this could not be then innate. Okay, because say for example, if a child is exposed to a language that have more verbs than nouns and the child is picking up more verbs on the basis of that language, just giving an example, or say for example, their understanding of the world depends on the understanding of their language, and there are so many different languages and cultures in the world, then we are basically saying that okay, this cannot be innate, because anybody born in any culture can be raised up by people who speak a very different language, and then that will create a little bit of a problem. You remember this problem also came up when we were discussing this aspect of forgetting the non-native contrasts versus remembering the non-native contrasts. Okay, so this is something. So the children, the category structure children develop reflects the kinds of language that the child is exposed to and the likelihood of different words appearing in different contexts rather than predetermined categories. So it is also often the case that some word might appear as a noun in some cases versus the same word can appear as a verb in a different cases. I clap, I was clapping versus I heard a clap. The same word is being used as different categories here. Okay, and that is also something that the child really needs to acquire and figure out. Okay, so this is about word category knowledge. Let us move to the second category of knowledge. The second category of knowledge is morphological knowledge. What is morphological knowledge? As I said, a word can exist in many versions: kick, kicks, kicked, kicking. Okay, you have to know the relationship between each of these words. How does kick move to kicks versus kicked versus kicking? The child needs to know the relationship between these versions also in order to be able to produce them at appropriate points and in appropriate places. So that is something which basically will happen if the child has acquired morphological knowledge correctly. Okay, so there is a question here: how do children learn about morphology, things like tenses, so to speak? Answer, a simple answer could be that they just pick it up, they just mug it, they just learn it completely. Okay, but then we see that children make a lot of errors with verbs. They come up with new verb forms. You might have heard of a child saying, I think that today there is a holiday. He will probably, in the initial days, the child will make an error as to this. They will not say, I thought that there is a holiday today or something like that. Children make some of these over regularization errors. Okay, because think the child has heard never, because nobody speaks think around the child. but then where is the child coming up with this kind of thing? Is probably that the child is making an effort to create this thing. Okay, they are making spontaneous speech, and in that sense they are coming up with their own ideas. So yes, there are again two views, the nativist and the probabilistic view. Let us first look at the nativist view. The nativist view says that the words and the rules basically are innately known. So infants begin by categorizing words, each verb as a separate category, and later what they do is they link them up. So if there are three versions of the verb kick, so kick, kicked and kicking, initially they will learn them up as separate verbs. So kick is a separate verb, kicked is a separate verb, kicking is a separate verb. Eventually what they will do is they will realize that all three of these verbs represent the same action, so they might be a related thing. So they will link them up, and once they have linked them up, what will happen is they will delineate a sort of a rule. They will come up with a rule which says that if you add ed to kick, it already becomes the past tense. So this is somehow they will kind of come up with this kind of relationship, and this, as I said earlier, leads to a lot of errors like over regularization. They will start adding ed to every known verb in order to make it into past tense. They will also come up with things like I drank, I drinked, I thinked, and so on and so forth. Okay. So following this, then how does the child learn the other kind of verbs, other kind of past tense forms of the verbs? So it is said that once the child has come up with this rule, the child will learn all the other forms as exceptions. Okay. So following this, a list of exception verbs will be compiled, and the child will basically be able to pick that up and learn that, and in a case where ed does not work, the child will use those exception verbs, and that is sort of how the child is kind of getting to the point that how verbs are learned. Okay. This is one way of doing it. The probabilistic contention is slightly different. The probabilistic contention is that it cannot be that children suddenly from a eureka moment start applying the rules. It probably happens in a way that children only gradually learn to mark out verbs using the regular past tense, and then later increase the use of the regular tense. So what they do is they begin with the regular forms, kick, kicked, play, played, sort of, they begin with this, and then gradually they start using it more often. Okay. And the regularization of past tense verb has actually been found to occur across some contexts more than the other contexts. So they kind of, in some contexts they know that this will fit in right away and they use it more generally. In some other contexts they probably are more hesitant in using these kind of verbs. Now one of the problems in really resolving this problem as to how children are really making this is that the studies of child language and studies of child language development are still relatively fewer, at least fewer than the amount they should be, and they are also plagued with sparse data problems. The data is not there so much, and you would appreciate, say for example, if you really want to document child language, you probably should document in a longitudinal sense how a particular child acquires language over time in his lifespan, and you have to have a lot of this kind of data, because that will probably be a good solution. Obviously there are ways to circumvent this, and there are plenty of cross-sectional studies which attempt to provide information and data so as to how each of these things are concerned. Now coming to the final part, coming to the part where the child now has a word, some degree of word category knowledge. The child also has some idea of how these particular words can change, so the child has some degree of morphological knowledge as well. Now what is left? The only thing that is left is start using those words and the variation of the words that the child has learned in longer utterances, in larger strands of speech. So let us see how that happens. Now there is a quote that Traxler uses, it's also very interesting, so I have also used it here, which says children have to work out how to talk about agent versus patient, location versus instrument, or beneficiary versus recipient. They must find out how to mark grammatical relations such as subject and object, and so on and so forth. This is by Eve Clark, and she points out this very neatly, that to start creating longer sentences, to start creating large strands of speech is not something that is very easy. It requires figuring out so many of these rules. You know, I was talking to you about these things when I was talking about verb learning, then this is what this is how complicated it is. So whether I went to have my lunch by the park. Is park an instrument by which somebody has lunch, or it is the location where I've gone to have lunch? Things like this, he did this to whom, he did this to him, something like who is the actor, who is the patient, all of those kind of things the children have to figure out. And we see that they do it, and they do it fairly well without a lot of explicit instruction, as we've seen in the earlier lectures, and they do it already by the age of 2, 2.5, 3 years of age. So let us see how is that happening. Again, two views, the nativist view versus the probabilistic learning view. Let us look at the nativist view first. The nativist view says that the basic knowledge that children need to combine words into phrases is already present in latent form at the birth in form of parameters. So children are born with these parameters. What are the parameters? Parameters are things, are small rules, like subjects would either come after verbs or before verbs. So the cat hit the rat. Okay, so the subject will basically come before hit or after hit. So the cat was hit by the rat, or the cat hit the rat. In one case the subject is coming earlier, and in the other case subject is coming later than the verb. And this is one of the rules that the child needs to figure out in order to understand this sentence and later produce a sentence of similar complexity. Okay, so infants need to figure out the settings of these parameters for their native language, and as soon as they figure out the settings of these parameters with respect to getting so much experience, getting and analyzing so much of standard input, that they will basically be able to start speaking equally complicated language. There is also an hypothesis in this sense which is referred to as the continuity hypothesis. The continuity hypothesis basically says that the phrase structure knowledge that children possess is just early form but almost equivalent to the phrase structure knowledge that adults have. Okay, so the idea is the phrase structure knowledge possessed by children is very early on is almost equivalent to the phrase structure knowledge that adults possess. So they are saying that those two are pretty much the same thing. Here just the parameters, the experience is not so much. Here the experience is so much so that parameters are set much in a much better way. And they supported by citing things like even in children's utterances, sentences have subjects, noun, phrases and verbs, and verb phrases also consist of a verb and a subject and so on. So pretty much the way children speak is just a microcosm, a more simpler way of how adults speak. The structural integrity is exactly the same. That is why people think that these two might be the same thing. Okay. However, this continuity hypothesis fails to explain how do children come up with ungrammatical sentences, because adults fairly usually do not use a lot of ungrammatical sentences. So how is it that the children come up with ungrammatical sentences? Okay, so this is something, say for example, an example utterance is I won't hold postman Pat. A child is saying to his mother that I won't hold, so it's not using I want to hold postman Pat. Okay, so how are these errors coming up if the level of knowledge of the child is equivalent to the level of the knowledge of the adult? So this is some of the problems with this idea, and because there is a problem with that idea, they have alternate idea. The alternate idea is the probabilistic view. The probabilistic view says that learning phase structure rules results from an analysis of the input that the children are exposed to. We have been seeing again and again, starting from the last trimester of pregnancy till 18 months, 24 months of age, that children are very good at processing the input that they are being exposed to. They are very good at analyzing patterns that are embedded in that input. And so why is it not possible that the child might be able to figure out the rules of grammar just on the basis of analyzing the input, analyzing the kind of knowledge that the child is exposed to? So this is the probabilistic contention as to how phrase structure rules are gained by the children. So children's phrase structure knowledge, they say, basically mirrors the frequency with which the sequence of words occur in the language addressed to children. So they say the way children learn language very faithfully represents the kind of language they were spoken with. Okay, so the kind of input they got kind of will reflect in the kind of output they give, and this correspondence is the proof of the fact that the children are analyzing this input, and by analyzing this input learning how language operates. So this is the probabilistic convention. An example could be that children exposed to verbs like want without the preposition to basically will create more utterances with the verb want without the prepositions to. Say for example, if children are exposed to words like I want dance, I want eat, I want play, then they will also create utterances like I want dance, I want eat and I want play, and they will not be able to know that technically the correct way to say this, I want to dance, I want to play, I want to eat. Okay, so this close correspondence is something that kind of makes this case. Now we have both of these views, and one of the things that kind of supports this whole concept of the nativist view is this existence of what is referred to as the usage based grammars. The usage based grammars basically say that phrase structure acquisition is closely linked to the acquisition of individual verbs. So they say is that what children are doing is they are not really acquiring the phrase structure rules in a broad sense, not like reading a grammar book overnight and knowing all the rules together. What they are actually doing is they are learning simply to use each and every individual verb. So they learn to use how this verb is used, what are the different forms of using this verb, and how this verb is used, what are the different forms of using this verb, and how another verb might be used, and what are the different forms of using another verb. And in doing mastering all the rules of these three verbs, they master a lot about how language works. And because they eventually master so many number of these verbs and they use it in so many different circumstances, this is probably how they are mastering phrase structure rules, and they are kind of perfecting their phrase structure knowledge. Okay, some of the evidences kind of point towards this idea, and they say for example, young children, they first learn about how individual verbs behave, and only gradually they start learning to form larger abstract classes of verbs by noticing their behavior in different instances. So initially children use the same verb, and they use the same verb in some situations and in some other situations, and after a point when they have learned to use so many different verbs, and after time they have kind of learned to master so many different verbs, is that they kind of start speaking language in a sense that they have idea of the larger rule set of the language. Say for example, children, in this is an example that Traxler puts in, the children are reluctant to move from mommy drank to mommy drank the milk. It only happens after adequate experience with language. Okay, so this is pretty much what I wanted to say about language development in infants and early young children. And yeah, so the take home message is that we just want to appreciate the journey it has been from the third trimester of pregnancy, when the child starts getting the first sound input, and from distinguishing the speech input to all other kinds of sound inputs, to the point of coming and appreciating single phonemes, to the point of forgetting non-native phonemic contrast and learning on native phonemic contrast, to the point of using those knowledge, the prosodic features and the other things, statistical bootstrapping, etc., to figure out how to segment the speech into words, to the point of learning how words are, how word meanings are deciphered, and to the point of gaining the word category knowledge, the morphological knowledge and the phrase structure knowledge that we talked about today. It is indeed quite a journey. Thank you. ये जल्दी हो जाएगा. I think it will be, yeah. In case you see I'm touching 25, tell me. I think this should. Hello and welcome to the course on Introduction to the Psychology of Language. I am Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur, and this is the final lecture of the second week. This week, as I've been saying, we have been talking about language development in infants and young children. We have been looking at various challenges that the children need to overcome or undertake in order to acquire language.